What's up, everybody? Garrett Hartle here from Out Reptiles. This week we're going to talk about Selayers. These island beauties, pure locality animals, were once considered by many to be the most beautiful of all reticulated pythons, if not the most beautiful of all pythons, period. But what happened was, with the morph craze and then the dwarf craze, Selayers kind of began to be cast aside as like the red-headed stepchild or just the other dwarf. And everything that we once understood about these animals began to become lost. So I want to take you guys this week on a journey into the Selayer Island locality so that we can rediscover our first love. So Selayer Island is a quite a large island with great altitude and a diversity of habitat, and it's very, very close off the shore of Sulawesi. There's also a tiny little island that's considered part of Selayer, even though it is a distinct island, known as Tombolongan. The animals from Selayer and Tombolongan were given the subspecies name Saputrii because their genetic material very closely was related to some of the Bantaeng region, Sulawesis, the animals, the mainland animals from the very southernmost tip of Sulawesi Island. So before these guys were even officially known to science, people in the pet trade highly sought after them, not only because of their slightly smaller, much more manageable size, but also because of the rich yellow heads, the bold black patterning, and then the variety. Because it is a larger island, you see actually a pretty good amount of variety. One thing that they seem to consistently have is an amazing kind of a donut neck pattern that extends pretty far down the body, and in some cases has huge striping. Side rosettes on Selayers tend to be brilliantly white, and the golds get brighter and brighter as they grow to rival any sunfire or platinum that you will ever see, without reducing the contrast that plays between the black and the white portions of the snake. Their head structure is also quite different from what you find in any of the other dwarf races. Selayers tend to have a very wide head from cheek to cheek, widespread eyes, and a really short kind of pug-like nose compared to the long narrow heads of the Jampeyas and super dwarfs. Now, because the island of Selayer is larger than any of the other dwarf and super dwarf islands, you see a lot more variety amongst the bloodlines. So here's a completely unrelated Selayer bloodline. You can see a lot of those similar traits, especially in the head shape, that cute, almost frog-like head. This bloodline has even more of it. And then the rich gold patterns, the very bold blacks. But in this bloodline, I absolutely love the crazy side stripes in the rosettes that pop out. Now, Selayers are the largest and most varied of all the dwarf and super dwarf subspecies, with adult females ranging 9 to 13 feet, males typically a little bit smaller. This particular girl is our frog-faced, stripy line. Super dark. You can see the richness and intensity of color on her as an older female that really has a lot of that amazing like rainbow shine quality to her. So some of these traits that are usually very subtle in other localities are really quite surprising and shockingly noticeable within the Selayer locality, which really makes them fun to kind of collect and maintain. Just a gorgeous, very naturally beautiful animal, exactly the way they are. Unfortunately, people stopped appreciating them exactly the way that they were with the onset of the morph game, and then shortly after with the actual dwarf and super dwarf craze that had a little bit of a spike after Bob Clark produced the first dwarf albinos and the first dwarf tigers. Super dwarf amels started to come onto the scene. Because people were chasing after these rare and obscenely different morphs, some of the more naturally beautiful varieties got a lot less attention that they had had in the past, and people stopped breeding the pure slayers. Now, around that same time, several wild-caught animals came in with morphs that were noticeably smaller than your typical mainland. Now, we don't originally know why. Was it a locality thing, a bloodline thing, or maybe they just had a really awful life in the importation process, and they didn't receive as much nutrition or whatever, and they came in with stunted growth. But people got into this habit of dictating the size of a bloodline based on small collection of wild-caught animals without seeing if they had any genetically different size limitations in captive bred specimens. Because dwarfs were becoming more sought after because of their larger market size, that is, more people can keep a manageable snake than a really gigantic one, a lot of these new morphs started being labeled as dwarves, even though their original locality data was never known. Nobody knew if they came from that South Sulawesi island chain of the Selayers and the Jampeyas. What we did know was that their offspring looked nothing like a Jampeya, and so because of the Selayers' more mainland looks and the variety that was in this, how they were lesser understood than many other of the dwarf and super dwarf localities, the name Selayer got kind of slapped on to any wild-caught animal that came in and bred at a smaller size than what people were seeing from their captive bred mainland animals. So some of these morphs, like Genetic Stripe and Sunfire, which came in a little bit small in the original imported adult, but didn't look anything like the Jampeyas or the super dwarfs, were basically called Selayers, using Selayer as the catch-all red-headed stepchild other dwarf locality. Now, don't get me wrong, if you do take a pure Selayer with this kind of color and contrast and breed it into morph localities, you can really bring out a lot of the color and contrast within those morphs and come up with some amazing animals. The problem is, many of the dwarf crosses that are labeled Selayers out there actually were never Selayer at all. So if you're buying something like a Genetic Stripe or a Sunfire, even albinos and tigers that came from a lot of the Genetic Stripe original complexes, if they are quoted with Selayer percentages that can't be traced back to an actual Selayer Island animal, but rather traced back to a morph, those locality percentages and bloodlines can't be considered accurate at all. Unfortunately, what we see all too often in captive bred breeding of dwarfs is a proverbial telephone game where percentages get higher and higher of different localities, or exaggerated from one generation to the next or from one owner to the next, without anyone actually ever preserving and maintaining diverse pure bloodlines of the dwarfs that they're quoting. The worst byproduct of this process is if somebody, let's say, assumed their Genetic Stripe was a Selayer, and they made something that was hatched out as a 50% Genetic Stripe bloodline, called a Selayer, the next owner might think, oh, it's pure Selayer, and then actually breed them into pure Selayers. The legitimacy of actual Selayer bloodlines was watered out almost completely, to the point where in the United States there's only a Selayer clutch hatched every so many years. Before these two clutches were hatched here, it had been 4 years since anyone in the United States was able to produce a pure Selayer. In truth, very, very few high percentage Selayer crosses have ever been made, especially in recent history. So with Out Reptiles specializing in dwarf and super dwarf reticulated pythons, one of the things that I wanted to do was go back and pull as many original sources of good, legitimate, pure locality animals as I could to pull them together and save them. In fact, Selayers were not even necessarily on my radar as far as one of the localities that I worked with. And oh my gosh, was I wrong. If you're looking for something that is sort of the lion of the dwarf and super dwarf reticulated python, Selayers are it. They're confident, they're bold, they're beautiful, they're unique, they're completely different looking. And they absolutely deserve to be pursued and preserved based on exactly how beautiful they are, coming straight from the conditions of their island home, and not to be pursued in label alone. some of these localities might be completely forgotten, just like Jampayas, if people like you and me are not willing to educate ourselves and understand the beauty of these animals and continue to love them the way they are into future generations. Take care, guys. We'll catch you next time.